umbrella term, Green New Deal. And we are excited to have 4 presenters tonight. Well, tonight, Europe time, midday here in Washington. We're gonna start with Ann Pettifor, and I'm gonna put people's biographies in the chat. And then we're going to continue with Dusan Pajovic, and then Asad Rehman and Clara Bourgin. In terms of the ground rules for our event today, each of the presenters is going to talk for approximately 15 minutes, maybe less. I will remind them when they get to the 1 minute left mark with this very sophisticated reminder. If you have questions, and we're going to keep the presenters to their 15 minutes so that we will have time to answer your questions, I'll ask you to put them in the Q&A so that we can track them that way. If you have comments you'd like to make in the chat, we'd welcome those as well. And I'll put some links in the chat as well to the webpage for our Global Just Transition Project, and a link to the next event that we'll be having next month on South Korea and South Korea's Green New Deal. So what I'd like to start with Ann Pettifor, and as many of you know, Ann Pettifor is a political economist, an author, and public speaker. She's the director of policy research in macroeconomics, which is PRIME, a network of economists that promote Keynes's monetary theory and policies. And her latest book, The Case for the Green New Deal, was published by Verso in 2019. So Ann, thank you so much for joining us today, and I'm going to go on mute. And I look forward to hearing what you have to say. Thank you so much.
Thank you, John, very much. And thank you for this international event. It's just wonderful to be able to coordinate across the oceans and across the world with you and with others. And it's a great honor to be on this panel with lots of wonderful women. I want to begin to say that my work is primarily, as John said, on monetary policy and theory, and I'm absolutely convinced that we cannot tackle the ecosystem until we tackle the economic system, and in particular the financial system. And that would be, you know, the way that would be the lens through which I'd be examining what Europe is doing. And so basically my argument is that the finance sector has a spigot, if you like, which it turns on and off. Mainly it turns on, and that generates massive amounts of credit, often very expensive credit in real terms. And that credit is then used to fuel production on the one hand and consumption on the other, which in turn fuels emissions. And for me, unless we follow that whole pipeline, and unless we tackle the spigot, the beginning of the pipeline, we switch off the pipeline at source, we're going to have very great difficulties in tackling greenhouse gas emissions. Now, of course, that's much easier said than done. We're up against Wall Street, we're up against the City of London, backed as they are by massively powerful and weaponized states, the United States of America, where both the left and the right would really not welcome us messing with Wall Street. Nevertheless, the financial system is fragile and precarious and prone to crises, and has to continuously be bailed out. The most recent bailout, of course, occurred in March 2020, when effectively the Federal Reserve, the Bank of England, the ECB and the Bank of Japan came to the rescue of private finance, effectively nationalized both Wall Street and the City of London for a period. And did so unconditionally. That's the thing that bugs me the most. You know, I think the monetary system is a little bit like our sanitation system. We can't do without it. If it goes down, we all go down with it. So I'm not entirely in favor of smashing it up. But I do think that when we do have to bail it out because it's so badly structured, then it ought to be on terms and conditions. And those terms and conditions ought to involve the ecosystem. And so my mission in life is to persuade those campaigning around the environment and the ecosystem to keep that perspective in mind, because nothing much will change as long as the banks, the asset management funds, the private equity firms, massive as they are, massively enriched as they have been by the bailouts of 2020, are pouring money into fossil fuels. And until we stop that, we have very little hope of change. And now I want to turn to the subject of our debate today, which is the European Green Deal. Unlike many on the left in Europe, I've welcomed the Green Deal, mainly because of two things. One, because it unites, or it brings together under one umbrella 27 countries. And the thing that we most missed in this global geopolitical state of the rising nationalism and rising authoritarianism is a failure of the international community to work together and to coordinate. We saw that most tragically through the pandemic, where the international community, as it's called, states just absolutely refused to work together to support each other to get through this crisis, and in particular, to provide a vaccine for everybody, not just for the elites, not just for the rich countries. And that failure of coordination is a huge geopolitical threat. We know that when states failed to work together in the 1930s, they ended up building up political tensions and rising nationalism and so on, which led ultimately to war, to violence and to friction. And indeed, while I speak, we are concerned, if we're all concerned about the United States' aggressive attitude towards China and China's aggression towards Taiwan, etc., and Hong Kong. And all of these are potential flare-up points. And all of this is because of the failure of leadership, if you like, on the one hand, by any state, in particular the United States, but also the growth of nationalism and authoritarianism. Now, Europe has that problem as well. But what Europe has is an institution, inadequate and weak in many ways, that brings together 27 countries and brings together countries as diverse as Poland and Hungary and Germany and France and so on. Now, that bringing together doesn't always work, but what it is aiming to do at the moment is to, if you like, embed in law terms for reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2030 of 55%. And this demand was made by the European Parliament. It had been, I think the Commission offered 30%, then 40%, and the Parliament kept ratcheting it up to 55%. Now, this is wholly inadequate. It's not good enough. It's not fast enough. We need to be aiming at 2025, not 2030. And there's everything that's wrong about it in that sense. But the good thing about it is that it's being embedded in rules and in institutions. And there are institutions that apply across 27 countries. Now, if only Africa had institutions and rules that brought everyone in Africa together around a plan for decommissioning greenhouse gas emissions. That would be a wonderful thing. And if only, other parts of Asia, for example, did that. So, this ability to bring together 27 countries seems to me to be a strength and something that the European Union should build on. And the second thing is the embedding in law, in making it, providing the institutions and the frameworks within which countries are going to be expected to operate and to be accountable for their operation, for the reduction of their emissions. Now, having said that, I'm not for a moment pretending this is the Green New Deal. It certainly is not, because unfortunately, the European Union is like all the other states, and in particular, like the United States, thinking that actually the capacity of the state to do this is inadequate and that we all have to rely on the private sector to raise the finance. I disagree with that. And I was struck by today, the European Union issued a green bond and wanted to raise 15 billion euros, I think it is, or dollars, I can't remember, in which currency I read it was denominated. And there was $135 billion aimed at that bond. In other words, the bond was oversubscribed by so many times. And that's because the private finance sector is, as I said, very fragile and very insecure at the moment, and is desperate to get its hand on safe assets, safe collateral. And the safest collateral, the safest assets in the world is not London property. It's not the Queen's racehorses. It's not works of art. It's not a Van Gogh. Those are not the most valuable. And it's not even oil or gas or coal any longer. The safest asset in the world is government debt. And the government debt of governments like the European Union, regions like the European Union, and governments like that of Britain and the United States, Germany, and so on. And we need to understand that as, in fact, a kind of citizen power. Because the private finance sector is so dependent on the state for safe collateral into which to invest their money and get a return on their money. The wonderful thing about a bond is that it issues rent. If you buy a bond, you can collect rent every month on that bond. It's called interest or yield or whatever word you want to use for it. It's an asset that yields income, unlike gold, for example, which doesn't yield any income. You buy the gold or you sell it, but you don't collect rent on it on a regular basis. With a bond, you can do that. And so bonds are incredibly attractive to the private finance sector. The fact of the matter is that bonds are only that safe and only that valuable because they're backed by taxpayers in the European Union, taxpayers in Britain, taxpayers in the United States, taxpayers in Japan. So because we pay our taxes every year and we pay them regularly, and I said, well, by we, I mean the majority. Of course, there are companies and individuals who dodge taxes, but most of us pay our taxes. And it's that generation of regular flows of income into the treasuries of the European Union governments and into the European Commission that makes their promise to pay in the future on that bond so incredibly valuable to the private finance sector. Nothing else can be trusted quite as much. Now, given that that's the case, given that the power of the European Central Bank to issue a bond, the power of the Bank of England to issue a bond, the power of the Federal Reserve to issue a bond is a power that's derived from us, the taxpayers, we should be demanding that those bonds should only be issued, especially if they're green bonds, so-called, with certain terms and conditions. You can have access to our bonds, but that's only if you are not invested in fossil fuels. If you're invested in fossil fuels, we're going to bar you from buying our bonds, from access to our central banks. Secondly, we are not going to accept your bonds, your corporate bonds, in exchange for liquidity, central bank liquidity, if those corporate bonds are dirty, brown bonds, if they are bonds, corporate bonds for fossil fuel activity. Sorry, no. We're not going to give you liquidity in exchange for those bonds. Right now, the central banks, the Bank of England, the Federal Reserve, the ECB, are very relaxed about accepting dirty bonds, if you like, from corporates, from big fossil fuel companies as an asset in exchange for liquidity. And I think the thing that bugs me the most about both what's happening in the European Union, in Britain, and in the United States is the passivity, if you like, of the public, the passivity of taxpayers who are, propping up the whole system, keeping it all afloat, keeping Wall Street fabulously rich, basically, and not demanding terms and conditions. So that brings me back to, while I'm as critical as anybody of the greenwashing of these countries, of Europe's weaknesses, and it's what's the word I want? It's weakness in saying, we couldn't possibly raise the money. We need private sector money. We need Larry Fink of BlackRock to give us some of his money, of all the money that he's mobilized. when today the state was able to mobilize 135 billion when actually it only needed 12 or 15 billion, shows a complete lack of understanding of the power that we have and that the state have. And that, of course, is part of the ideology of the state as being unimportant and being subordinate to the interests of the private finance sector. Whereas I think we should be arguing for the state to be, for the private finance sector to be the servant to the state and not the master. So my problem with is that for all its weaknesses, I think the greater weakness is on the left. The greater weakness is the failure of green movements and left movements to mobilize opposition and strong opposition to the power of the Wall Street fossil fuel funders. And by that, you know, I'm not wanting to be too critical of the fabulous work that has been done by, for example, Greta Thunberg, who's mobilized the world's children, really. But the rest of us are all, you know, going about doing God knows what without coming together, if you like that. I'm beginning to argue for a campaign like Parents for the Future, you know, getting all the adults together, for God's sake. But somehow or other, and this is a long time grievance of mine about the Green movement, is that it prefers the fragmentation of the movement into pure little blocks or all across the board, from a massive mobilization where we unite forces. I read today that something like 85% of the American Republic are backing the progressives in the American Congress, who are demanding that more of the infrastructure bill that's being debated should go to climate. You know, it's wildly popular, this, but those masses haven't been mobilized enough, in my view, to challenge the power of both Wall Street, but also Frankfurt and also the City of London. So before we begin to criticize what is already being done, I would argue that we should do more ourselves to unite the movements. And I'll stop on that note. Thank you, John.
Fabulous. Thank you, Anne. That was wonderful. So we are now going to move on to perhaps a different perspective from Dusan Pajovic. And Dusan is the Green New Deal for Europe campaign coordinator at DiEM25. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with DiEM25, that stands for Democracy in Europe Movement 2025. And he is a social psychologist, and he is going to look at perhaps a little bit more critically, or a more critical view of, not that, Anne, you weren't critical of the European Green Deal, but Dusan, why don't you take it away, and let's hear a different perspective perhaps on the European Green Deal.
Thanks, John. Let me just share my screen first. Okay. Sorry. Great. So first of all, it's a big honor to be here with you today. I'm really glad that we got together to talk about this topic, and thanks to Diane, who spoke before me, and to other two comrades who will speak after me. I'm glad to be with you today. As you know, the title and the whole subject is about the European Green Deal. Is it a step forward, sideways, or backwards? And let me first state why this is important. Because, for example, European Union and Europe as a continent is one of the biggest polluters in the world. We have one of the largest greenhouse gas emissions in the world, and we have historical and current injustices that needs to be solved towards the other part of the world. That's why we need something new and we need something green. Unfortunately, as it seems, European Commission itself didn't go to the European Green Deal because of this reason, but because of some other reason. So let me state first why this Green Deal is a good thing. I mean, what are the good sides of it, not why is it a good thing. First of all, it's extending carbon pricing to the new sectors with their new Fit for 55 package, and as I like to call it, Fit for 51% package. As well, one other good thing. That can also be a bad one, to be honest, but I really tried to at least name two good things regarding this policy package, so I left this one on the good side. It is that we are incorporating environmental discourse, because vast majority, more than 90% of Europeans think that climate change is a real problem that needs to be solved more thoroughly. And this Green Deal, this Green Package, is something that at least takes that into consideration on some kind of level. Now, already on the bad sides, just a second. First, this package is not enough to limit average temperature rises to 2 degrees Celsius, let alone 1.5 Celsius that scientists say that we should aim for. Also, transport and housings are going to be included in the ETS, which is emission trading scheme, which may sound as a good thing to some people, to neoliberals and so on, but it's not, because common people will feel this on their skin, and they are going to see it when they go to the gas station to pump gas into their car, or when they get heating bills. So once again, common people will pay for the sins of big corporations. Also, there's not even a word about public housing, which is a big topic. Homelessness is a major problem in the whole world, and in Europe especially. And there are a lot of vacant homes. Look at the periphery of Europe, for example, like 25 to 30% of homes are actually vacant. They are used by politicians and oligarchs that visit them just once in 2 years, or they are completely empty and abandoned, or they are being used for Airbnbs, then don't pay taxes, and so on and so on. We need to buy those houses back and repurpose them to be homes. So also a big topic that comes right after housing is, of course, green jobs. And European Commission is really big on this one in words. They say that they are going to open 160,000 jobs in infrastructure. But when you compare it to the active population of European Union, it's basically nothing. It's like 6.5% of active population. So this is something that we should really take into consideration when we look at their numbers. Also, what we are referring to as DiEM25 and what even European Commission is referring to is that New Deal by Teddy Roosevelt, but it's nowhere near that policy package. Because, for example, Teddy Roosevelt opened with his team, of course, more than 20 million jobs in just 2 years, from 1933 to 1935. And this is a much bigger scale and much concrete solution to the coming crisis. They also planted more than 3 billion trees and so on, but I won't go into details. With their 51% project, they are also molesting Global South again by having import prices and by not really taking into consideration the historical injustices that Europe has towards Global South in general. And they talk about vague and loose allocation of 250 to 350 billions in a decade, which is nothing. Like fossil fuel industry gets every minute $11 million in substitutes. So it's completely uncomparable. And whenever we say that we need more money, they say that it's not possible. But it is possible when they bail out banks, when they bail out big corporations, fossil fuel industry, and animal agriculture. Then it is possible. That's why we in DiEM25 advocate for around 5% GDP yearly to go into green bonds, which is around 750 billion euros. And we advocate for net carbon neutrality until 2030. while Green Deal by European Union proposes 2050, sorry. And is it really the best that we can do? I mean, we are one of the continents with most resources. This should be a deadline for the world and not for Europe. Europe must lead this transition. That's why, let me quote the article that I wrote with Lucas Febraro, our communications director. The European Commission had at least the decency of dropping the word new when they co-opted the term Green New Deal, erased all meaning from it, and unveiled the European Green Deal in 2020. Indeed, it is new. Indeed, new it is not, but nor is it green. As the word deal, we can only understand it as a tribute to the background dealing between Brussels career politicians and well-paid lobbyists that brought this disastrous plan to life. Sorry. On the contrary, Green New Deal by DiEM25 is a deal between humanity and nature, not between politicians and oligarchs. Everyone in Europe, your voice is needed more than ever. To all of you who are watching this, I'm saying this. And you should learn more about the Green New Deal for Europe, organized by joining DiEM25. I will leave a link as soon as I'm done speaking, and help set the course of this campaign. The future is up for grabs, and let's seize it before it's too late. These are only some of the reviews we've got for our Blueprint for Europe Just Transition, and big thanks to Anne Pettifor, who also helped us write it. This is according to Bill McKibben, founder of 350.org. This is the first attempt at a political solution to climate change that is on the same scale as the crisis itself. The most comprehensive program in Europe for the historic challenge at hand, said by James Gilbride, and so on and so on. For example, Caroline Lucas, UK Green Party MP, said that it is a clear and comprehensive policy package with the spirit of openness and participation. I'm just now teasing you to read our blueprint. That's the whole idea. I don't have time to present it all now, but let me say that it's not just semantics. Green Deal is not the same as the Green New Deal that we offer, that Anne offer, and that many other progressives offer. That's why we need to push it right now. In our Blueprint for Europe Just Transition, we say that the process shouldn't be top down, which European Commission is actually doing. So we need to form at least 3 big bodies for starters to kickstart this green transition. The first one is called, in our case, Green Public Works, the investment plan to power Europe's green transition and transform its economy along the way. The second one is Environmental Union, which would be a new regulatory framework for the just transition, aligning Europe's law with the scientific consensus. And the third and final one would be Environmental Justice Commission, which would be an independent body to research, monitor, and advise EU policymakers to advance the cause of environmental justice across Europe and around the world, with taking into account intergenerational, intersectional, and international justice. So that's why, as I said, we need Green New Deal that will come through deliberative democracy at the municipal, regional, national, and European levels. This is one of the ways we can push for it. So you will see that we say that Ursula from Brussels cannot know better than people who live here in Lisbon, for example, what needs to be done in Lisbon. We need to align people's needs with the scientific consensus and then make the policies and push for those policies along the way. So let me remind you that Green New Deal by DiEM25 is a workers-friendly solution that is green in both its nature, not just in its cosmetic, and that is a radical yet realistic solution that is completely necessary. And that's it from me, and I'm looking forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Dushan. That was wonderfully succinct. You came in underneath your 14. I didn't even have to show the little sign, which is wonderful. So
Thanks,
both of
John.
the speakers have been very cognizant of their time limits. So they've set a good example. And for our third speaker, who is Asad Rehman, and for those of you who don't know, Asad is the executive director of War on Want. And that's where he organizes to put an end to poverty and injustice. He's a longtime climate justice campaigner. Prior to his executive director position at War on Want, he was the head of international climate at Friends of the Earth. So Asad, thank you for joining us. As I told other people, you get the 1 minute warning at 14 minutes, but maybe you won't even have to see that sign. So I'm going to hand it over to you, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you, John, and I'll take your warning to heart. Thank you for the opportunity to join you all today and on this incredibly wonderful panel with such powerful words of wisdom. It's always a challenge to follow my fellow panelists. Like, I nod along with so much of their analysis and mention the COVID pandemic. And if we view it as a curtain raiser to the climate crisis, then we see the reality of rich countries, including the EU, and the hollowness of their statements that no one is safe until we're all safe, while of course at the same time putting the profits of big pharma ahead of the lives of people in the global south. And that is to some extent the template of how wealthy nations are responding to all this crisis that we face. And the reality is, of course, 5 million deaths, hundreds of millions of COVID cases, reality of a COVID vaccine apartheid, death and illness for the poor, and the hoarding of vaccines in Europe, and the turning of its back on the global south, forcing many of the poorest countries into more debt-creating IMF loans that require a new wave of austerity and public sector cuts. And I think we need to take a step back and, and recognize that the moment we're in, from whether it's from the shackles of slavery to the gunboats of colonialism to the whip hand of neoliberalism, this politics of sacrificing those in the global south has created this world, and that's now riven by deep imbalances of power, and of course generated by these historical injustices, and that all of these systems of injustice, of course, have become entrenched, and they're so hardwired into our economic political systems that the reality, as we all know, is we're not equal, neither in our exposure to violence or injustice, nor in our capacity to be able to address it. And whether we look at the pandemic, the climate crisis, crisis of economic inequality, or the deliberate impoverishment of so many countries through unjust and unfair neoliberal economic policies, we know at the center there continues to be this active denial of the right of every citizen of the world to be able to live with dignity. So we're in an interesting moment because there seems to be a widespread recognition amongst politicians and policymakers that this magnitude of this crisis we face, facing humanity, dwarfs anything we've ever previously faced. But it sits alongside what I call a cognitive dissonance about the scale of urgent and ambitious action that's needed. And it's only matched by the shrugging of the shoulders by the richest when you actually point out their responsibility for this crisis. So the EU's co-option of this Green New Deal frame and promise that it will herald this green transition to address both the climate crisis and the domestic crisis of economic inequality. The question for us as internationalists, of course, remains, are these proposals fair? Are they just? And what do they mean for the majority of the world's citizens? For those of us who've been working on a framework of a global Green New Deal that situates itself in the realities of the front lines of injustice rather than the capitals of power, I think there are 4 critical tests that we must measure the EU's Green New Deal on. Does it meet the goal of limiting temperatures to well below 1.5 degrees with everyone doing their fair share? Does it tackle economic inequality and ensure that everyone has a right to living wage, workers' rights, social protection, free and universal public services? Does it put well-being and the right for everyone to thrive in balance with planetary limits ahead of unsustainable growth and extraction of resources? For instance, making public goods such as energy and food and housing a fundamental right for all under democratic and public control, equitably shared and not for profit. And also, does it undo those embedded systems of injustice, those racism, patriarchy, and economic injustice that have become embedded into our global systems? For instance, how do we move beyond a circular economy to a circular world where the financial flows at the scale commensurate with need and without conditionalities? Will it deliver the technologies needed for a justice transition that are not going to be subject to the barriers of TRIPS or unfair trade rules of corporate control? And does it recognize that the wealth of the global north, of course, and its capacity has been built on the extraction of resources and exploitation of the people in the global south? So you've already heard, and I don't need to spend much time setting out the climate case. We know, we've all heard code red for humanity, humanity at the crossroads. There is absolutely no end to the alarm bells that are being rung. And whilst limiting the temperatures to below 1.5 degrees as set in the Paris Agreement is repeated ad nauseum by politicians, including by the EU, we know the reality. We're heading towards a warming of at least 2.7 degrees and global emissions are increasing. But what's really telling is the actual carbon budget for 1.5 seems to be absolutely willfully ignored, or some magical fantasy accounting and relying on unproven and risky technologies around what I call the magical unicorn that is the net zero 2050 goal seems to be at the center of policymaking. And look, we all know that historical emissions matter both in terms of capacity and responsibility. But when you look at the IPCC report, we can see that we now have less than 500 gigatons of CO2 for the remaining carbon budget of 1.5 degrees. By the end of this year, we'll have burned through 89% of that budget for a 2 in 3 chance of meeting the 1.5 degree guardrail. And let's dwell on that for a second. That means there's a 1 in 3 chance that we'll breach the 1.5 degree guardrail. And whilst no temperature level is safe and it's deadly for many, we know that begins to spiral into runaway climate change that will dwarf all the killer fires, floods and famines that we've seen causing havoc and destroying lives, livelihoods and the economies of the global south. And it's interesting that no policymaker in the Commission would be as bold as to countenance a public policy for European citizens that included such risk. Neither would those same policymakers board a bus or train if they were told it had a 1 in 3 chance of crashing. But that's exactly what is being sold to the global south, who will face the worst impacts. And yet the EU, as we've heard, represents some of the richest countries in the world, those most responsible for the crisis, with the most capacity to act, and also with the legal obligation to act. So the so-called Fit for 55, the 55% emission reduction target by 2030, that will create what we're told is the first climate continent that is ambitious and just, ignores the requirements of both science and justice. And alongside promoting the Green New Deal, it's fascinating to see the EU then continuing these plans for more capture of the remaining carbon budget, a modern form of carbon colonialism, pushing for more loopholes through offsets and carbon markets. We've moved from a moment of climate denialism to what is now mitigation denialism. And of course, the result is justice denied. So on its first and most important test, it's absolutely failed. The second, I also don't need to give you chapter and verse about inequality. We all know it exists both within rich countries and of course between the richest and the majority of the world. And whilst the world is of course abundantly wealth, and we see wealth increasing each and every year, the reality still is that half the world is struggling to survive on less than $5.50. Half have without access to electricity or clean cooking, 2 billion people facing issues of hunger, lacking housing, health, education. And that global inequality, of course, is not getting better, it's getting worse. And that's not accidental. As we know, it's a deliberate result of policies that put competitiveness and control of resources ahead of people. So whilst the European Union talks about setting up a fund to tackle inequality within Europe, neither the Green New Deal or the EU's other external policies acknowledge that tackling global inequality must also be its cornerstone. Instead, as we've heard, the language of competitiveness dominates. And we all know tough talk on climate change means little. Alongside the Green New Deal, the EU continues to pour billions into fossil fuel subsidies, locking the European Union into a massive new expansion of fossil fuel infrastructure, even as the IEA categorically states that no new gas, oil or coal expansion is possible. European financial institutions, both public and private, continue to provide the financial oxygen to the industry, and policymakers continue to do what I say to the rest of the world, not what I do. We all know nudging finance to do the right thing, as Anne said, isn't sufficient. We need immediate regulation of finance, putting binding regulations on corporations to meet the goal of 1.5 degrees and tackling inequality. But also the overconsumption and increase of energy use remains an absolute cornerstone, despite its claims of energy efficiency domestically. The EU continues to devise policies around expansion of resource use, from green metals and minerals to new metal mining, and estimates, as we know, that will see a doubling of current resource extraction, when of course sustainable use of our planet's materials would require a reduction by at least a half. Its claims of do no harm within its own policies, of course, is do harm to the global south. And we can see that with the trade rules that continue to be promoted by the European Union at the very same time as it loads its Green New Deal. Lower environmental standards, lower health and consumer protection, writing corporate courts, the notorious ISDS, into trade rules, whether it's with Vietnam, Mexico, and Indonesia. And whilst the Green New Deal talks a lot about, its values of precautionary principles for Europe, of course, those don't apply for the global south. And, the Green New Deal, the European Green New Deal says it will unlock 1 trillion over a decade for this just transition. We've seen from the reports from UNCTAD and countless climate scientists who've calculated the scale of finance needed globally to meet both the climate goal and the 2030 SDGs would be in the scale of about 1.4 trillion a year for the next decade. And we know that for a decade, we've had this climate promise of 100 billion, and that is still being unmet. That, of course, is still overwhelmingly relies on loans and recycling of other commitments. And today, you may have heard the president of the COP26 once again announce that the 100 billion will be met, but again, from the private sector. At the very same time, of course, the EU and much of the global north continue to benefit from the $24 that flows from the global south to the north for every $1 that flows from the north or south. So in this moment of civilizational crisis, how do we ensure that our responses aren't shaped by politics that lacks imagination and ambition and continues the same failed and deadly approach that makes the poorest pay the heaviest price? And so whilst the EU seeks to normalise a politics that is walls and fences around Europe, of gunboats and criminalising those who seek safety, it's not sufficient to simply say, well, this is a step forward, because the truth is winning slowly is the same as losing. So this is a moment for us to actually put forward a broader and a more ambitious vision for a genuine Green New Deal within the European Union, but also part and parcel of a global Green New Deal. And I agree with Anne, that question is not simply about having vision and not simply about having the right political demands. It's about building power. It's about weaving our movement of movements together. It's about then targeting our political leaders and the institutions to deliver the actions that we needed. We all know that transformation has only come through the power of people. And that really now has to be our rallying call, a rallying call around a global Green New Deal that delivers not only for the citizens of Europe, but delivers for the citizens of the world.
Asa, thank you. That too came in under your 15 minutes, in addition to being rousing. And I'm particularly struck by your winning slowly is the same as losing. I'm going to come back to that sentence later on. Our final presenter is Clara Bourgeat, and thank you patiently waiting for this slot, Clara. She is the Policy and Advocacy Officer at Counterbalance, which monitors public finance institutions and actors, especially in Europe. Clara, the floor is yours.
Hi, everyone. And yeah, thank you so much for inviting me to speak at this first event of this really great initiative, and to be very grateful to be part of this impressive line of speakers. So I'll try to, it'd be difficult to follow up, but I'll try my best. Let me share my screen. So I'll be talking more about the public financing of the Green Deal and what is being, sorry, too fast. Slideshow. Okay. So yeah, I'll be talking more about the financing, which is an issue that has often been left aside in debates about the EU Green Deal. So I'm very grateful to be able to speak more about this today with you. So first, a few words about Counterbalance. So we're a coalition of 9 NGOs working on EU public finance. And we were set up back in 2007 to more specifically to target the European Investment Bank, which is the bank of the EU, and have since then led campaigns to make it a more sustainable and democratic institution. And aside from working on the EIB, we've also monitored different investment plans at the European level. And what we've done in the last year is to look more into the European Green Deal and what's on the table in terms of the financing. So the financing pillar of the Green Deal is called the Sustainable Europe Investment Plan. And its aim, as Assad also mentioned, it's to mobilize 1 trillion by 2030. And in practice, it's made of 25% of the EU budget, which will be targeted to climate and environmental investment. When this amounts to, so this is in the period 2021 to 2027. And this amounts to 503 billion, which will also aim at mobilizing, triggering other national co-financing of 114 billion. Then there's InvestEU, which is a guarantee fund from the EU budget to the European Investment Bank and other public banks, and aims at mobilizing public and private investment of around 279 billion. Thirdly, there's the Just Transition Mechanism, which aims at mobilizing 100 billion euros over the period 2021 to 2027. And extrapolated over 10 years, this amounts to 143 billion. And finally, the innovation and mechanization funds are also counted under the SEIP, and these are financed by part of the revenues of the EU emissions trading system. And this will amount to 25 billion euros. So even if the implementation of this financing pillar has just begun, there's already clear trends that are emerging. So with Counterbalance, we've identified 3 main issues, structural flaws that make it not really up to the task to really respond to the challenges that we are facing. So first of all, as has been said also by speakers before, it's very much, it's an undersized plan. The 1 trillion is actually mainly a political announcement. It doesn't even reflect what will actually be invested by the EU. And so most of it is basically what it's expected to leverage by, from the private sector by these investment mechanisms. And most instruments are actually simply relabeling of already existing investment program. So for example, InvestEU is simply a continuation of the previous FC program, which was the European, the previous, sorry, I have to look back. The European Fund for Strategic Investment. And actually the only 2 new things are part of the Just Transition mechanisms. So the Just Transition Fund and the Public Sector Loan Facility. But despite the novelty and the added, the added value that they could bring, they're also undeniably of very limited size. So they could be considered more as pilot initiative rather than very significant investments. Then secondly, one of our criticism is the strong bias in favor of the private and financial sector. So one stated aim, as I said, is to use public finance to de-risk private investment to leverage, private finance. And this this approach ignores the fact that a lot of the projects that we need for a truly just and ecological transition will not be bankable or offer a return of investment in the short term. And this also risks, there's also a big risk around the SEIP and the sustainable finance agenda behind it, that it will reinforce the financialization of our economies by increasingly channeling public funds into private equity, so-called green finance and other investment schemes at the expense of the real economy, and also furthering inequalities within and between countries. And then finally, our last criticism is on the, in the ones that I wanted to point out today, because I imagine there's a lot of criticism that can be given, but it's on the top-down approach of this plan. So looking at how the EIB and InvestEU will function, it is quite unlikely that decisions about loans and about financial instruments will be taken in a transparent, accountable, and participative manner. So following this criticism, we've tried to sketch out our proposal for what the EU public financing and financing of the Green Deal could look like. And it would be one that could work towards the decarbonization, the definancialization, and the democratization of our economies and societies. And we consider that these three dimensions should be taken all together if we want to actually achieve systemic change. So first on decarbonization, it's also the idea that the solutions to the climate crisis should not only be green, but actually contribute to a real transformation of our societies. And for that, focusing on essential public services is key and should be at the heart of the public mission of the Green Deal. Another concrete proposal is to introduce strict social and non-environmental conditions on all of the financing linked to the Green Deal. And yeah, so that means, of course, no more financing to fossil fuels and other environmentally harmful activities, but also making sure that there's meaningful conditions on human rights and workers' rights, and for them to be really embedded in all of the ACIP funding. And then finally, it's crucial to decolonize the Green Deal. So even though there's an urgent need to transition to low carbon societies, this should not be done at the expense of people and communities in other countries. Then secondly, we looked at how we could use public finance to definancialize the economic system. So one key challenge today is not only about reclaiming public finance and public investments as an alternative to private finance, but it is also about activating actually one of the most powerful tools that we have at our disposal to shrink private capital markets and to rechannel private wealth into public interest mechanisms that can act progressively outside of the pure market logic. So one proposal, for example, would be that instead of giving out big credit lines to equity funds and private banks, public investment banks could, and also funding programs under the SCIP, could fund cooperatives and other actors in the social and solidarity sector to set up community-led banks that can invest directly in the local and sustainable economies. So by offering them very long-term bonds that can be managed outside of the pure short-term profit maximization logic of markets. And this way, progressively, more investments could be taken out of over the hands of private investors and being directed more by the public in the public interest. But for that, of course, we need to democratize and be able to hold public financial flows into account. So following the subsidiary principle, have democratic decision-making where decisions can be taken at the most appropriate level and not follow a top-down approach where that ignores local realities. And this is where having a more decentralized web of sustainable and democratic public banks would be crucial. And of course, ultimately, there is a need to fundamentally reform the institutions that are implementing the SCIP. So for example, the EIB and other national public banks, so that these institutions can become easier to control, so that they can actually prioritize quality over quantity and have the right safeguards and conditions in place over the use of public money. So I'll keep the conclusion short, but just to say that, for us, we believe that if we centered around the public good and democratized, the Green Deal and its financing could become a good opportunity to actually use public money for a truly just and environmental solution. And the current financing over the Green Deal could become a sort of laboratory in this regard. So for another type of financing. So beyond decarbonization, also looking at how public money could be used to actually definancialize the economic system and definancialize the economic system and not be remove itself from the pressure of the financial markets. So I really hope that the elements that I presented today can give you some food for thought. Also, I forgot to mention that these elements are also going to be part of our new reports that we'll publish next week. And I hope that we can start a debate on how to reclaim public finance for the public good. And also, so I'll stop for now and look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Clara. That was excellent. And you had perhaps the hardest topic, which is, at least for me, I find the topic of financing so complicated, but this was very clear, and I really appreciate that. I'm going to ask folks to put their questions in the Q&A, and I'm going to scan that, but I will also take the first crack. And, all of you have presented both, I think, pointing out some of the advantages of the European Green Deal, especially given what we have here in the United States and in some other parts of the world, but also you've leveled some pretty significant critiques. And I am struck again by this sentence that Assad made about moving slowly is winning slowly is the same as losing. And given that as a reality, because winning slowly against climate change is quite clearly a loss if we don't reduce carbon emissions quickly and have some chance of getting underneath 1.5. When we look at the European Green Deal, we have, it seems, a period of time where we can make some interventions. And the question is, are there useful interventions that we can make? And when I say we, I don't mean, as individuals, but again, mindful of what Anne said in terms of movement building, we as a movement, what are the interventions that we can make during this process to push this enormous edifice of the European Green Deal in at least a somewhat better direction? Again, mindful that, once again, a slow win is not a win at all. And then second, for those of us outside of Europe, are there any mechanisms by which we can influence this? Or is this a European game with only European players having an influence? And a number of you have pointed out that, the global South is going to be impacted considerably by what happens in Europe. Are there ways for the global South to make their voices not only heard, but their demands actually met in transforming the European Green Deal as we move forward? I'm going to ask Anne first, since you started off, if you have any thoughts on either of those questions.
It's a really, really big question. I think what has to happen is A, we have to mobilize, but B, we have to have something to mobilize for and behind which we can all stand. In other words, there has to be, if you like, a banner behind which we all stand demanding change. And then secondly, we have to understand our power use that power. At the moment, we don't understand our power. So, my answer is always a bit pathetic, really, I feel, given the need for urgency, as Assad rightly argued. I mean, for me, the real first task is understanding and speaking to the public in language that is accessible and that mobilizes. And then secondly, I think it's really important for us to overcome our divisions, and to also not wish to always be, if you like, the most pure and the most advanced and the most radical. There's been a very interesting essay written here by a prominent Green activist in Britain, in which he's argued that extreme rebellion, for example, represents, if you like, the radical flank of the movement. But that radical flank is running out of steam. Why? Because it really doesn't have, it's not unifying. It's not bringing into the movement, if you like, those in the middle and even those in opposition. The whole point about leadership is to be able to bend public opinion behind progressive policies, and to bring public opinion behind us, even those that are hostile to us. Now, I mentioned the polling numbers in the United States. There is clearly a majority for radical action on climate, because these people are already living the climate breakdown, and yesterday we heard from China's coal field region is being swamped with floods at the moment, and coal mines have had to be closed. Climate is already impacting on people, but where are they being mobilized, and how are they being mobilized? So I think the public will is there. What is missing is the channel. How do we channel that into action? And I don't have an answer. I begin by saying we've got to help the public understand the problem, and we have to then also help the public understand what has to be changed, who has to be changed. But the problem is, for me, that the finance sector, if you like, Frankfurt's finance sector and Wall Street are all invisible. They're not tangible. They can't see them. When you drive into a garage and to buy oil, there is something very tangible there. If you look at an oil company in the United States or a fracking outfit, it's there. You can touch it. You can see it. You can't see finance. You can't see what it's doing, basically. You can't see its power. Its power is immense. But what you can see is the role that taxpayers play in backing up the private sector, the role that the public sector plays in providing support. The private sector wouldn't make the capital gains and the profits it makes without public institutions like, for example, the law that enforces contracts. We live in Britain, and Britain can be a pretty lawless place, but right now Russian oligarchs come here to secure contracts. They come here to process their divorces because there's no legal system in Russia that protects their interests. And yet we allow them to come here and exploit our public institutions. We, the taxpayers, have built the legal system here, and we don't ask any questions. We think it's wonderful to have Russian oligarchs wandering around London, et cetera, et cetera. So, and we vote for the politicians that support them. So something is terribly wrong with the way in which we, I think, who define ourselves as progressives, have organized or failed to organize. In Britain, we've had to face the fact that, we failed. We failed dramatically. As a result of our campaign, the Conservatives here have the biggest majority they've ever had in history. And that's a painful realization, really. And it means we really have to think hard about what our tactics and our strategy. Anyway, I'm waffling now. I'm not helping at all. I'm conscious. But I think at least we should admit to that. And we acknowledge that, and we begin to think, the children have mobilized. The children have a leader. She's wonderful. She's a young girl, and she's exercising the most extraordinary leadership. And she's mobilized the most extraordinary gang of people, of young people. But really, you know, why is it on the shoulders of these young people? What's happened to the, if you like, the adults in the room? Why aren't they offering that sort of leadership as well to the world? And, you know, Greta hasn't just mobilized one section of the world's children. She's mobilized them all. You know, there's no argument about, you know, where are you on the spectrum, on the left spectrum here? She brings everybody into her camp. We don't have the same happening, if you like, with the rest of the movement. Anyway, I'll stop at that point.
Thank you, Anne. That's very helpful. Dushan, you laid out actually, you know, a very clear kind of set of three alternative institutions that could govern a kind of authentic European Green New Deal, one that in which all the terms actually were relevant. But I'm curious whether, as we try to build those institutions, is there any, from your point of view, is there any benefit in engaging with the European Green Deal as it is currently constituted in order to push it in a better direction? Or is that simply not a useful task?
Well, I would say both, that DM works as both as a movement and we have our own electoral wings. So we need to push the structures to do better, but also we've got disappointed and tired of that many times. That's why we formed electoral wings, because as it seems, for now at least, you cannot push a rotten structure to do something good. For example, for Green Deal to be called Green New Deal, it has to have some kind of frameworks, like, let's say, at least publicly owned, the money should funnel to the publicly owned companies, to the companies with workers on boards, or even one person, one share system. And we should have less working weeks, like 4-day work week with less working hours, 6 hours a day, because we need the radical degrowth as well. And we don't really see that happening with the current structure of European Union and European Commission. So we need to push as a movement, we need to bring and create people's assemblies all over Europe as well, but we need to fight in the political arena with political parties as well. That's why we have the Congress of our new German electoral wing on the 13th of November. And that's why we have our comrades working hard in Greece, called our party called Mera 25.
Excellent, thank you. We have an excellent question in the Q&A about extractivism, which I want to get to. But first, I want to go to you, Assad, and what are the mechanisms by which the voices of the Global South can be heard, not only heard, but actually have an impact on the debate in Europe today?
Well, I think my starting point would be, first, we have to learn from the mistakes of the past. We have to look and say, how did we get here, right? And there is a lot of culpability, right? There's a culpability of how climate was framed, the actors that dominated the climate space. We all remember, you know, climate, the story was white polar bears on a white iceberg, right? It was empty calls for action. It was ignoring the realities of the economic system and believing that somehow climate could be resolved with that. Even though within all of these organizations, there was an understanding of that this climate was ultimately a structural and an economic and political, as well as an environmental issue. So, you know, how do we move beyond that? Well, you know, Frederick Douglass, you know, famously said, power concedes nothing without a demand, right? It never did and it never will. And, you know, for too long, our demand has not been a demand, right? It's been empty calls to act. You know, individuals act individually, act of this, and of course that's all been co-opted. You only need to turn on the television now. On every advert, it's all about us as consumers, right? Us as individuals acting. So there is a moment, right? We know we need to build a movement of movements. That's absolutely clear. To build power requires a movement of movements. But to do that, again, we know from our own history, you need a vision. You need to be able to describe the world that you are trying to create, that people can see themselves in. It's no good saying to people who are struggling to basically make ends meet, everything is going to be all right, when they will hold on to what little they've got because they understand what decades of deindustrialization, of austerity has meant to the poorest people. They've been the ones that have been thrown onto the scrap heap. It means having the right concrete political demands and not being afraid of making those political demands. As Anne said, it's interesting because you look at polling all around the world, and individually, each of those policies, whether it's about control food or energy or public control or living wages, they all poll really, really highly, right? People have got an intent to be able to support them. What they fear is the ability to be able to implement them, and then they retreat. That means you have to build the power around it. Now, there is a lot to be said, and that's very, very positive about the fact that the climate strikers in the global north have moved the dial on climate in a way in the last 2 or 3 years that, decades of campaigning by mainstream environmentalism hasn't. But, of course, they come on the back of climate justice groups in the global south who have always talked about that very intersectional way of talking about it. I remember us fighting in Copenhagen, right, for limit temperatures to well below 1 degree. 2 degrees is death for Africa. I remember all of the mainstream NGOs, the big brands standing against us alongside the European Union, claiming that the European Union was a climate champion. We're seeing that logic and that rhetoric again of this co-option. So we need to do both popular education in terms of socializing this message out, but we also need to do political education within our own movements as well, so that those hundreds of thousands of young people who are turning out on the streets today, actually understand what we're fighting for. Because if we don't provide a demand and a vision, and people will say, let's take action on climate, but let's take action on climate that, of course, veers into eco-fascism. We saw with the German elections, right? Young people didn't just vote for the Greens or the Progressives or the Die Linke. They were also voting in huge numbers for the right, using the same arguments about climate and saying it's a climate emergency. We have to shore up ourselves. So this is a very, very pivotal moment. We know change is coming, right? The question is, of course, who's changed for who and what? So to me, this is a deeply political question that the left has, generally left and progressives, have shown the same dissonance actually as the right on the climate crisis, right? Oh, this is another thing, it's abstract, it's over there, it isn't immediate, it isn't real. We have just a material, we're only interested in people's material conditions today, but without understanding, obviously, about the realities of both the climate crisis and ignoring the realities that there is a danger that the transition in the global north will be British workers and European workers against workers of the rest of the world. How do we do that? Well, there's one very, very important word, and I've always said it's the most important word in the language of the working class. It's the most important word in the language of the global south movements, and it's the most important word that I learned in my formative years in the Black and anti-racist struggle. It's the word solidarity. And without that concept of solidarity being rebuilt, we're not going to get the internationalism that is required. So you can see climate action, but you may very well see it within the border walls of the global north. How do we move that? That is rebuilding internationalism. I mean, I come from a tradition that, of course, understood colonialism and anti-imperialism, and it's been lost, and we have to retell those stories and rebuild and be able to articulate in a political language that is accessible. And I totally agree with Anne. I'm not here for purity. I'm here for telling the truth. And as long as you tell the truth and say this is the scale of what is needed, we may, look, there are many climate scientists who already say we've lost 1.5 with the committed emissions in the atmosphere, that really what we're fighting for is, are we going to limit temperatures to 2, 2.5, 3 degrees? Where are we going to finally land? We know that every 0.1 degree that we prevent is lives and livelihoods that will be saved. And to us, there is no end to this battle, because it is a fundamentally a transformation and a civilizational battle. So I don't see it about winning only at the COP26. I see this as being, how are we constantly strengthening our movements and weaving those together? And there are great examples, of course. You know, who would have thought Chile of Pinochet would be the Chile that took to the streets and overthrew and is reimagining Chile outside of the neoliberal paradigm. Even Europe, there was a time when kings and queens, nobody ever thought that we'd overthrow them. We've overthrown all of these things. So I'm an optimist, and I think we have to be optimistic within our movements as well.
John, can I just come in here? Sorry because I think Asad has raised a really important point about the question of a demand, and that we need to make a demand. And one of the things that really disturbs me is that the big corporates, when they realized the scale of what was coming, decided to invent this thing called the carbon footprint, in which, you know, responsibility for carbon was dispersed amongst everybody, when we know that the top 10% of the population of the world, and that's the North, it's the rich, the top 10% are responsible for 50% of all emissions. And if we just focused on the top 1%, 10%, and argued that they're the ones, you know, that have to give up their frequent flyer privileges, that have to stop buying huge motor cars, that have to stop blah, blah. You know, if we turned our ammunition, if you like, on the top 10%, instead of saying, oh, we want carbon taxes that are going to affect everybody, we've all got to change our behavior. That's really, really hard. But if we demand that the top 10% transform their behavior, I mean, I think that unites people, and it says, look, you know, we know where the trouble lies, and the trouble doesn't lie with ordinary folk. It doesn't lie with Africa. It doesn't lie with the poor. It lies with the rich. It lies with all those, you know, the biggest emitters are not people like you and me. We may emit some carbon, but mainly that's because of the framework that's been created for us. But really, what we have to do is change the rich. Anyway, that's where I think we should be going in terms of a demand. And I think that Asad's absolutely right. That's what we have to formulate, is a demand.
Excellent. So,
and John, I have to also apologize because I'm going to have to go soon, I'm afraid.
That's okay. We'll all be going soon in about 10 minutes. But if you have to leave early, that's perfectly okay. But I think your point about, in a sense, a climate populism, translating this into political, have a chance of mobilizing a broad sector of the population is very useful. Clara, I want to give you a chance just to answer on quickly, if you can, if there's anything, you know, Counterbalance is recommending as a kind of next step for especially kind of raising this issue of public finance within the context of the European Green Deal. And meanwhile, the rest of you can think about the several questions that have now emerged about green extractivism and targeting urban mining as a sector to push forward, and as well this question about how rich countries can actually very concretely support the transition of global South countries to a green economy. But first, Clara, do you have some thoughts quickly on next steps?
Yeah, I mean, what we've tried to do with our report is really to try to start a discussion about these issues. So there's money on the table, not enough, of course, and there's loads of issues with it, as we've highlighted. But there could be a way of using it in another way, of trying to actually make it used for the public good, and to really work towards a just and ecological transition. So we try to be ambitious in our demands as well, and yeah, I think there's a lot of work obviously to be done to really reforming public finance, because a lot of it is not there yet. But there's discussions on it also in the US, about this great discussion actually happening there, and I think these are also often missing in Europe. So this is really the work that we're trying to do, to have other civil society organizations working on this, and yeah, to try to reclaim public finance so that actually can serve the public. And yeah, so I tried to keep it short, very short, because we don't have that much time.
And we all look forward to the report, which will come out next week, and
Yes.
we make it available to everyone who has signed up as well. Who wants to take a crack at these more specific kind of questions? One on extractivism and so-called green extractivism, and the second on kind of concrete measures for the global north to actually assist the global south in a sense leapfrogging into a cleaner future. I will go with whomever wants to try to answer those questions. Dushan.
I will try to be brief in order to give my colleagues a space to answer as well. But let me say that we need to completely renegotiate EU trade rules to support diversified and self-sustainable economies in Europe and around the world. And we need to recognize ecocide as a crime against humanity. And basically, we have to establish environmental abuse directive to recognize that environmental destruction is a threat to human and non-human life. That's the only way we can save ourselves, with international agreements and international protocols and World Trade Organization rules. That's the only thing we can do in order to stop, one of the things at least that we can do in order for the Europe's just transition not to fall on the back of global south. That shouldn't be the case at all. As I said, we have the historical and current injustices that need to be solved, and reparation money should be sent to that side as well to help them with their own just transition. We are all sharing the same world at the end of the day.
Excellent, thank you. Assad, did you want to take a crack at either of these two questions?
Yeah, I will, and I will be brief. In fact, I've just posted in the chat to Daniel a report we did on a just transition is a post-extractive transition, and why there needs to be a huge paradigm shift in terms of that. But just in terms of immediate focus and just with Anne and everybody here, I'm joined with you. I'm just remembering, of course, Seattle and you know, the powerful movements that we had then. You know, weaving together these movements, talking about the trade rules and WTO, and of course that fell off the political agenda for many people over the last decades. But the climate waiver, I mean the vaccine apartheid and vaccine waiver, as I think opened up a moment for us to have a bigger conversation about trade. So we think coming in at, for example, arguing for climate waivers, right? That all technologies that are needed for the justice transition to be freely available goes to the heart of tackling, of course, the unfair trade rules. Tackling the ISDS, this investor state dispute settlement, goes to the heart of the way that our global trade system is being set up. We know that the reality of the solutions is going to be the old slogan, one no, many yeses, and it will be different in different contexts. But there are some key fights that we can do that alter the dynamic and allow the policy space for countries in the global south to be able to develop alternative differently, right? We know that, you know, whether it's been progressive governments in the 70s, anti-imperialist group, there's always been this fight in terms of how are you able to, you know, meet the needs of your own citizens when you're locked into a global trading system which forces you into export commodities into the supply chains. We need to be able to break that. But breaking that, and we as War on Want work a lot with garment workers, and it's a very interesting, I think, story of how the different movements can go so wrong in this moment, right? People look at, for example, the fashion industry and the garment sector and say, oh, it's terrible, it's really climate polluting, it's unsustainable. What I will do is I will not buy, right? And ignoring, of course, the millions of garment workers who are being left destitute and all social protection. And how do we then start to talk about actually what control of a supply chain and a sustainable supply chain actually begins to look like at all stages, so that it's not the poorest who are carrying the cost of that. And of course, it is absolutely possible to do that. We know that we have to decentralize production, and it has to be sustainable, etc. So all of those things are really are important. I think a critical part of the climate movement is shifting the climate movement away from seeing climate as climate and shifting it to seeing it as being an economic and political, and getting those young people that we keep talking about, targeting the WTO, targeting the IMF and the World Bank in the same way that they're coming out on climate. And John, just whilst I'm talking, I'm going to be very brief. You mentioned something about, earlier about, what do you do for people who are in the US about affecting, the European Green New Deal? Look, I see that Tom is on this call as well. I think that we know that the push is exactly the same, right? How do we get the US to do its fair share? How do we get the European Union to do its fair share of effort? How do we start to calculate what those financial flows are? And then how do we make sure that our domestic demands are also connected to international demands? And too often the domestic demands are separated from our international demands. It's like they operate in two different worlds rather than making the same demand. If we're fighting for public services in Europe, we should be saying public services in Europe and globally. We're fighting for NHS, if we're fighting for social protection. How do we weave these stories and these demands together so it's not and, but it's not or, it's an and together? And I think that's the only real alternative.
If I may just add one sentence, somehow I forgot to mention one really big thing, which is the fact that European Union must stop all unnecessary military equipment movements, and the EU must be aggressive in its common foreign and security policy in preventing wars and conditions that give rise to war by negotiating a new international convention for the elimination of war. In that way, we can encourage our comrades on global south to redirect that money towards climate disasters and preventing its influences.
Excellent. Thank you. That's a very good place to end. I would like to thank all of the presenters today. You've really provided us with a much clearer understanding, not only of the European Green Deal, but of the stakes in general that we face both within Europe and outside of Europe. As I said, this is the first of a number of presentations we'll be doing that provide updates on where we are with Green New Deals and similar initiatives around the world. We'll be doing one on South Korea's Green New Deal in November, and then on from there. We'll be preparing a report based on the conversation here, which will go out to a larger audience so that we ensure that the wisdom here is put on paper and sent much further afield. So once again, thank you all for joining us, and I look forward to seeing you at our future events.